Hello and welcome back to DriveDriverDriven. I'm Humble and we're still on the Blunicorn project, but this time it's coming back apart. I mentioned this previously that the engine has to come out again and the transmission and the exhaust to address a few issues. Mainly it's a low oil pressure issue. So once the engine's warmed up and the oil's warmed up, I'm seeing idle oil pressures between 9 and 11 psi, which is terrible. And then when you rev the motor, it gets up to about 20 to 22, which is also terrible. And you just can't drive it like that. I think I know what the problem is, thanks to some sharp eyes from a couple other Ultima owners. And we'll get to that once the motor's out. The other things we have to address is we're going to put in the RPS clutch that we sort of bypassed just to get the car running, but it absolutely has to go back in, otherwise the engine will blow just like it did previously. And then lastly, the mufflers and the exhaust needs to be repacked because it's basically all blown out, and one of the internal baffles is rattling around, so we need to get that fixed. We've already started because I forgot to start the time lapse. So let me show you what we've got so far. Already got the clamshell off, but that's nothing doing. There's just a couple of bolts that unbolt from the hinge down here, and it all comes off very, very quickly. Next steps are to get the engine oil drain, to get the coolant drained out, and then start removing everything we can off the top side so that we can get to everything and get the motor out. So I'm going to set up the time lapse and we'll get to it. Okay, so fast forward a couple of days and a wardrobe change, and I'm back on the motor now that we have the car all torn apart. So here's kind of the mess we made. This was one of the things that a sharp-eyed friend of mine had found. We pulled the oil pan off to remove the windage tray. I don't know how I missed it, but it's clearly labeled in the instructions in several places for the ARE dry sump pan to remove the stock LS7 windage tray. Even though I went out of my way to buy one and install it, I never should have on this engine. So this is, again, the Texas Speed. It's basically a Leroy short block. So it's the same basic configuration as Leroy. It started life as a 5.3, then it's bored out and sleeved with Darton sleeves and has all forged rotating internals, the PRC heads, like what have you. It's the same basic base motor, although this one's got a higher compression ratio than, say, Leroy would be running with the twin turbos. The base difference, though, is that my previous engine was an LS7 and this one started life as a 5.3. There's a couple of important differences between the two engines that I completely forgot about, because on all the Ultimas that I've been working on, we either installed LS7 engines or replaced the motor that was in it with an LS7. Now, I mentioned before that I've been having low oil pressure issues. And by low, I mean very low. So hot with the oil at about 185 degrees. I was seeing idle pressures around 9 to 10 PSI, which is unthinkably low. And then with any kind of revs, it didn't matter how much, it would go up to about 20, 21, somewhere around in there. And, you know, when it was hot, and that's it, nothing higher. And so I knew there was a problem. And if you've built an LS motor in the past, there's a few likely culprits. So if you look down here underneath the front of the motor, if you have the internal pump or an internal dry sump pump, your oil pickups are here, and there's a gasket that gets pinched between the front cover and the oil pan. And if there is a messed up O-ring or anything like that, you could lose scavenge, or you could lose pressure, because your pressure stage also goes through intersection of the pan and the front cover / block. Another potential cause is behind the water pump here and behind the timing cover, there is a cam retainer plate. And a funky part of the LS engine design is that the oil galleys for the cam come out to the front cover across and then back through the other side. And there's a pressure channel that sits behind that cam cover. And again, there's an O-ring that seals that. Another likely component is, we can't see it here, but behind this adapter plate and back behind this cover, on one side there's a freeze plug or an Allen key plug, depending on what your engine was built with. And then on the other side, there's kind of a barbell design that allows oil to pass in one direction, and it blocks the passage in a different direction. And it's this kind of T-shaped intersection that sits down in the block down in this area. And if there's a tear on the O-ring, or it's not installed properly, or it's just an old one that's been reused, those can have an issue. However, that's unlikely with a new engine build. Lastly, there is a big important difference between the LS3 and the LS7. One that I had overlooked when, basically we're putting everything together in a rush. And that has to do with what's underneath this valley cover. So if I remove this cover, I haven't removed it yet, But I've been talking with the support folks over at Texas Speed because they're the ones who built this engine. You know, I lamented the fact about the low oil pressure, what oil I was running, which was the break-in oil supplied with the motor, which is BR40. You know, I was using the oil pump that was supplied with the engine, which is a K-Tech high scavenge, high pressure pump. I don't believe it was a fault of theirs. I just wanted to know of a couple ideas that I could check easily without hopefully having to tear down the entire engine. And the ones I've saved so far require a little bit of a teardown, but not a crazy amount. The easiest one, though, was pointed out underneath this cover, and that is on the LS7 engines that I've been working with to date, the displacement on demand systems aren't drilled out. There's pedestals underneath this cover, and in the LS7 they're never drilled out, so there's never a point to leak there. This cover and the gasket that's underneath it were for an LS7, and they do not have a provision to block those open displacement on demand activation ports. So chances are that's where all my oil pressure is going. So I'm going to pull this cover up and we're going to take a look. And that's exactly right. So these are the open ports I was talking about. So on smaller engines, like the 5.3, the 6.0, 6.2, etc., there is an additional activation system in this valley cover that will disengage cylinders for displacement on demand, to effectively cut the displacement in half for emissions purposes, better cruise, better gas mileage, that sort of thing. What was happening is there's nothing blocking these ports, so they're just, well, geysering high pressure oil into the top of this cover, and it was starting to leak past this gasket in the front here, off on the sides here, wherever it was close to the edge. I was seeing a little bit of oil buildup in the valley, and that's where it was coming from. To the support guys over at Texas Speed who posited this idea, who helped me out over the weekend, you guys nailed it. You're absolutely right. And thankfully, it was something as simple as this. What is our solution? Well, there's a couple things you can do. There's either O-rings that you can just set into place and then carefully put the cover back down, cinch it down, and that should retain the pressure, but that's not a fail-safe solution. The next step is, there's a few products online, but I went with Texas Speed since they helped me out so well. And there's little plugs that you tap into these holes, and they're held in place by the cover after the fact. And that effectively blocks all the ports here, and all the pressure should be back up to normal. And normal is something like, 40 to 50 pounds of oil pressure at idle, and then a steady 40 to 50 pounds or 40 pounds or so at rev, wherever the bypass circuit is set to. So unfortunately, I can't do anything about it today. I'm still waiting for those parts to come in, but that answers a big question for me, and it proves that the guys over at Texas Speed were right, that, well, I'm not used to smaller engines, I guess. So I just wanted to point this out because that's a super easy mistake to make when you're putting these engines together, something to watch for. And I didn't necessarily need to pull the engine to fix this, but the engine had to come out to address a few other issues anyway. However, this could have been fixed with it sitting in the car. Even if you don't have an Ultima, if you're running into a similar problem with low oil pressure, chances are it could be one of those seals or one of those points that I mentioned earlier, especially after a fresh rebuild. So I think that's going to do it this time around. Not much of a video. Unlike other videos in the past, we're actually sort of caught up to real time. I'm kind of hurry up and wait on parts And then once we get this all put back together, it'll go back in the car and we can see about dyno time, some more street tuning, and just further dialing in the last however much percent of the build, because those last little bits and pieces are what take up the most time. So that being said, thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you next time.